This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft, because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hey, Alida here. Just a quick introduction to today's episode of the Storyworks Roundtable. I think you're really going to enjoy this. We have a pretty lively and fun conversation about the Arcless Protagonist, which, could be kind of a hot topic for some people. Could also be a relief to hear someone actually talking about the upside and some of the iconic literary figures out there who are Arcless protagonists and, loved by many and selling millions. So if you enjoy this episode, and hopefully all the others we're putting out, please make sure you subscribe and leave us a review. We would sincerely appreciate that feedback. And while I've got your ear, just a quick reminder that the Storyworks Guide to Writing Point of View is now available for purchase. One Amazon reviewer writes, "Another home run from Alida. I've collected bits and pieces of POV theory over the years, but she brought it all together in one comprehensive book and filled the gaps in my understanding. Never have I read a more detailed and well-written explanation of the role of the narrator. I finally get it. You should get it too. By that, I mean you should get the Storyworks Guide to Writing Point of View today." And thank you, because I could not have said that better myself. So, without further ado, today's Storyworks Roundtable, Robert, Kathryn, and I debate the merits of the Arcless Protagonist. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to today's Storyworks Roundtable. We are talking about the Arcless Protagonist. This might seem like an oxymoron to some of you. How can you have a hero without a character arc? And others of you might champion the idea. In the Storyworks Guide to Writing Character, I spoke about the importance of the character arc, and I had an exception to the rule. I used Sherlock Holmes as the exemplar for the Arcless character. And I noticed in one of the Amazon reviews, somebody commented on that. He was relieved to see that I had acknowledged the possibility of an Arcless character. And then recently I put out the Storyworks Guide to Writing Point of View. And in that book, I said, your protagonist must have an arc. Now, this is not really a contradiction, because I do say the book's about rules. There are exceptions to every rule. Those exceptions can't all be addressed here, and this is a companion to the character book. So I covered my bases, but one of my advanced review copy readers pointed out that I said, you must have an arc, and I was like, uh-oh, I should have stated the exception here. So it seems to be something of a contentious topic for some people. I was even told that people are touting the necessity of the arc, which I certainly have done and will continue to do, but with the caveat that there is this thing, the Arcless Protagonist. So let's define the Arcless Protagonist briefly, and then we'll discuss, as we always do. So the Arcless Protagonist is a hero who has longevity in a series that readers don't expect to evolve over the course of the series. So Sherlock Holmes, many other detectives in the mystery genre, this is very common. So what this does for the reader is you don't have to read the stories sequentially, because your hero's life isn't going to be that different from one book to the next. There will be minor changes, but nothing so significant that you're going to be lost if you read the story out of order. So the protagonist is a fixed feature of the stories, and what the reader gets to enjoy each book is a different plot. But of course, those plots are within the bounds of the reader expectations in that genre, as with the mystery. So, anything you guys want to add to the definition of the Arcless Protagonist, or, this hot topic? Have you heard contention about it?
Oh man.
I suppose what, as a reader, what you expect is that you have an attachment to that particular character, and in a way you don't want them to change because you picked the book up thinking, I can't wait to see what this man or woman does this time around to beat the villain, and not necessarily wanting them to change because that's what you're reading it for. So I know, and maybe it's like a fast food meal where you're not really expecting anything deep from it, but you know that it'll fill your stomach. And I don't mean to be derogatory about it either. I mean, these can be fine books. Sherlock Holmes is a great example. So perhaps fast food isn't the same. Maybe your favourite local Italian that has one particular dish that it's the only reason you go there, but you just hope they don't put it off the menu, or you hope they don't change it.
Right. Yeah, good point. So with the Arcless characters specifically, the reader doesn't want to see that character change.
Yeah, or might find it disturbing. I've held up the Dresden Files as examples before, and it's certainly, I wouldn't say it's an Arcless protagonist at all. There's a very definite arc through there. But there are occasions where the change within the protagonist is quite significant, and it can be disappointing sometimes. Oh no, I want the old Harry back, the one who's who did this or that and the other. But then the writing is so skillful that you get caught up in the reasons behind the new changes, and of course the new changes bring conflict, etc. So, so I can definitely relate to the appeal of the Arcless character. I mean, I love the Jack Reacher stories. You could argue there are some arcs in there maybe, but it's mostly flat. Yeah. Mostly what you expect is that Reacher's going to stroll into town, trouble will find him, he'll kick the living daylights out of the trouble, and then move on, and that's it.
Right. Jack Reacher, James Bond.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, no matter how many different actors play James Bond in the movies, he's always going to be James Bond. There's only so much differentiation you can bring to that character from one stage of the franchise to another, Your fast food comparison was interesting, Robert. I was thinking as you were talking about those books that it's the formula. He's going to go in, find a bad guy, kick some butt, etc. So it's that movement through the plot, different set, different villain, different setting, different, but basically it's all going to be the same as last time around. We know the stakes are going to escalate at a certain rate. We know that the bad guy is going to be this kind of bad guy, that the fights are going to be these kinds of fights. It's, we always know Sherlock is going to look at somebody for 2 seconds and tell him where he grew up and what he had for breakfast and which train he rode in on. And that's part of the fun. That doesn't change. And, Miss Marple's going to be drinking tea in her cottage, glancing out the window, and
Right. So it's kind of like, to continue the fast food analogy, or even really any franchise restaurant, it's like you go eat, the set dressing may change, but the food's still going to be the same. It's different restaurant, different location, but the menu is exactly identical. So, yeah, you always know what you're picking up in terms of that character in that book.
Yeah. So what are the advantages of writing an Arcless protagonist? What do you imagine, or what can you see as being, the advantages to this?
Yeah, you can really get to know how your character is going to respond in any scenario. I mean, it's I suppose there's a certain predictability of the protagonist, and that then gives you license perhaps to, I've heard it said that the argument could be that the arc is within the villain or the setting. And because the protagonist because you don't want to read a book where everything's the same at the start as it is at the end. So if the protagonist is going to be the same at the start as it is at the end, something else must change. So maybe it gives you license to be ridiculously far-reaching with all of the other things. Because who is it? Is it Stuart, I can't remember what his name is, the book Architecture Method, where he talks about having a bunch of themes or series that thread through a book, and it's the overlapping of any of those series at any moment that makes what he calls a key. I can't even remember the terms now. A key point, but the reader always expects that there's one which they call the home series, where it's where you're tracking the book. So it might be a place, it might be a person, it might be a particular theme, where the detectives always regroup in the station, or it might be that Hogwarts is always where things come together, or so there's a sort of a familiar place. And I suspect that in the Arcless thing, the protagonist is the familiar place. So it gives you license, therefore, to know, okay, that's the familiar place, so therefore I can go wild with everything else because it won't be confusing to the reader.
Interesting. Yeah, I know. But as you were talking and using the word place, I was thinking, 221B Baker Street and, Miss Marple's cottage and Murder, She Wrote, whatever that village was on the East Coast. And, so the set pieces become just as familiar as the protagonist to us and just as endearing.
Yes.
Yeah, I suppose one of the advantages of the Arcless Protagonist is that that's an element of your story you just don't have to write, So the emotional arc doesn't have to be that deep or that varied. No. You could still have family relationships and subplots, but they aren't going to be the kind that carry over from one book to the next, and they aren't going to be the kind that create reversals of fortune so that you can create the non-sequential series.
Yes, I remember picking up a Jack. Sorry, Kathryn.
No, go for it.
First. I just remember picking up a Jack Reacher book, and it starts. He's got a broken nose, and I think, oh. How did that happen? It's one of the very few carryovers between one book and the other. There's just so little. And I had to go back and read the other one to find out what happened.
He didn't tell you? He didn't provide the backstory in the current book?
No.
Odd. Okay.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. What were you going to say,
Jack
Kathryn?
Reacher's character arc. From no broken nose to broken nose. No,
that's as deep as it gets.
No, but you were talking earlier about how, if you have a Arcless protagonist, like maybe you can change other things. And I think, just thinking through, I haven't really read much Jack Reacher, but the first Jack Reacher movie that came out with Tom Cruise in it as Jack Reacher, I would argue that the secondary character, the female protagonist, she changes dramatically from the beginning to the end. And so while he necessarily doesn't always change, but it seems like she's just as much a huge part of that story. She's a secondary character, but not really. She's forefront, front and center, and she has a huge arc in the way her mindset just completely shifts over. So I think, maybe you have a Arcless protagonist in quotes, but somebody else who's major in the story is still going to have an emotional journey that they're going on that maybe the protagonist is facilitating. Especially things like Sherlock Holmes and things like that. They've all they're changing someone's life dramatically in the way that they're acting.
Well,
exactly.
I'm glad you said that, Kathryn. In Sherlock Holmes, Watson is our narrator, and he does have an arc over the course of the series. At the beginning of the book, he's got kind of the PTSD from the war and the limp, and then Sherlock convinces him to give up his limp, and he meets Mary and he falls in love and all that kind of stuff. And he is the character we can identify with because he has emotional depth, whereas Sherlock is so cold that we were fascinated by him, but we can't necessarily imagine having him in our life, or if we did, it would not be in a cozy, friendly way. But Watson, we could be buds with Watson. We could have him over for dinner, and he's the peripheral narrator. So Sherlock remains the protagonist, even though Watson is the narrator. But he's the one with the arc, and he's the one we identify with emotionally.
Right. Would you say that he's the one that has the emotional stakes in the story? Because Sherlock just doesn't seem to care. Yeah. But for Watson, he's the one that has all of the emotional issues that he has to work through.
Definitely. And in the newer series on BBC, the Sherlock, with Benedict Cumberbatch, they play on that quite often, where Watson is, yelling at Sherlock for lacking the emotional depth and for what he puts him through. And especially when Mary is part of the series and there's all that danger to his wife, and, Sherlock fakes his death and then he comes back and Watson won't forgive him for a while. So they definitely play that up to great effect in that series. Yeah. And so one of the things, for better or worse, about the Arcless Protagonist is you will probably be lacking some emotional resonance there with the reader, because you aren't playing those subplots as fully as you are when you've got a character arc. You aren't trying to show somebody's human evolution over the course of your series, So whether you consider that a pro or a con, that would factor into writing the Arcless Protagonist.
Well, I think that's what gives it depth, isn't it? Because without that, you're probably into comic book territory, where your Arcless protagonists do live. It's just wham bang, another story done. But something, and I think Kathryn's point about Jack Reacher is really clever, because as I think about it, there's always somebody in trouble. So it's not that trouble finds him, it's somebody has trouble. There's always a victim. The victim doesn't necessarily have the arc. Sometimes they're just the victim, but there's usually someone in there who has tremendous emotional arc as a result of Reacher's intervention. So I think that's really insightful that comes through in the movie as well, because it certainly comes through in the books. So I guess if you're planning on writing a series that has perhaps a superhero or perhaps, a detective or something, and you want that to be a repetitive, almost serialized series, so it's not a connected series, then it makes sense that if you want to really gain readership, the depth is going to come from the arcs of the secondary characters, but they have to be pretty important secondary characters. They've got to be critical to the plot, I guess.
Right. Now we know Watson covers the whole series, but what about other series? Can you vary the secondary characters so that arc is book to book with different supporting characters filling that role of emotional depth and relatability?
Well, yeah, Reacher's example, for sure. James Bond to some degree.
Yeah, I think if you have a protagonist that you really don't want to have any series effects on, like, literally the trouble he gets in book 1 has nothing to do with book 7, and he doesn't, it's like it never happened at all, ever, then you have to have a whole different set of supporting characters. Otherwise, something from book 1 is going to come back to bite him at some point. If he stays with any characters, there's going to be resonance from one book to the next, just based on actions. So.
Right. Well, and one of the uses of subplots and supporting characters is raising the stakes for your hero, so that the danger isn't always just to the hero. It becomes also about the loved ones, the family, And when you're talking about comic books, Robert, that reminded me, I think it was Batman. I don't remember which. I think it was the movie with Heath Ledger as the Joker or something. I don't know. He had, and correct me if I'm getting my comics mixed up, but I think he had a love interest, and then the Joker killed her at the end. Right? So you've got this potential for him to find love, which would change his personality, because then he could soften, he could relax, he would have someone to go home to, he might rethink vigilante justice as a whole. And if the writers allowed that kind of character, that kind of love and support, hence evolving his character, Batman would not be the same superhero anymore.
Right.
And that could be unpalatable to your readership.
So I like the solution. Just kill her off and strengthen his whole vigilantism.
Right. I mean, it's got high stakes. Readers are going to mourn the loss of the love interest if you do it right. And, and then Batman's got a new wound to carry around as he goes forward and kicks bad guy butt.
And bonus, they created a villain all at the same time. So
exactly. Yet another villain. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah. So drawbacks to the Arcless character, what do you see as the danger zones?
Well, to go back to the restaurant analogy, you get fed up with it.
Right.
It becomes too predictable.
Yeah.
So I think in that respect, this probably is one of the more challenging things, to write because, okay, so we get to forget about, whatever it is, the 19 or 42 elements of the hero's journey. Throw those out. But you can't throw out good storytelling. It's still got to be something that's engaging and
right.
Where you want to find out what happens next, even though you know that ultimately the protagonist is going to find the same old, it has to feel different.
Right.
Otherwise, it's like you live in a town where the only place to eat is that restaurant. Right. And the only meal they serve is your favourite meal. And after a while, it's just a wear.
Yeah. Be like a library with one book on the shelf. Okay, I guess I'll check it out again. Yeah. Today I guess I'll check out James Bond again. Yes. Yeah. Well, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote in his journal, his diary or his autobiography that he was blamed ferociously for killing Sherlock Holmes. People were so angry at him. The Strand magazine, right after they published that story, they lost 20,000 subscribers, like instantly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And young men in London were wearing black armbands to mourn the death of Sherlock Holmes. And Conan Doyle wrote that it was justifiable homicide and self-defense because he was so fed up with Holmes. But then, he had to bring him back because of peer pressure or audience pressure. Wow. He brought Holmes back. So you definitely run the risk of creating tedium for yourself.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, as a writer as well. And then it becomes hard to create stories that are engaging because, we all know that if you're bored with what you're writing, then chances are the reader's going to get bored.
Right. Or, a reader might not because they can read 10 things between your stories. People read so fast. And for us writing, it's kind of all you do.
Yeah.
I
just think sometimes if the fire's not in your own blood, though, when you're writing a scene and it just doesn't work and then you realize it's because you don't like the scene. So you throw it out or change it and all of a sudden, I'm enjoying writing this now. And I think there's a big argument in fiction anyway for being very connected to the enjoyment of what you're writing. So even though certain parts might be harder, so, I find maybe description harder, for example, than, say, dialogue or action. But that's okay. I can go back in and add that later. But if the scene itself just is excruciating to write, then in my head I'm thinking, if I'm finding this excruciating to write, surely the reader isn't going to enjoy it either, to some degree.
Yeah. But, you can work through that and create a great scene on the page. But think again of Sherlock Holmes. Okay, I need Sherlock and Watson in 221B Baker Street. I need to knock on the door. I need the landlady to come in and they exchange snarky comments. And then I need the woman in black in the veil to walk in and give her some.
Once you've done 20 of those.
Right. So it is very formulaic, back to that fast food analogy. And this was, Pulp Fiction of its time. It was serialized in a magazine and it was very commercial and highly successful. And then that made it so Conan Doyle, anything else he wrote, didn't get any attention, So great commercial success can lead to this other predicament. So you've got to know that you want to go into that type of writing. That type of sort of fast food, formulaic, meet reader expectations every time kind of writing.
I guess that's why, I was thinking about other repetitive fiction, such as, say, TV serials. I suppose that's why they have writers' rooms, not only because they have to deliver fast, but it keeps it fresh because you've got multiple creative brains on it.
Right.
When it's just you as a writer, you can imagine Conan Doyle's predicament there of trying to bounce around in your own head, go, how do I come up with something new for Sherlock this time?
Yeah. Well, and to reverse engineer all of that stuff. Okay, so this character came from this location and he came by this method and he came, okay, so now what little things is Sherlock going to notice? Okay, he's going to notice a cat hair on the coat and whatever. So, wow. And it's not, I'm not trying to make a value judgment that it's wrong to write that kind of fiction. It's just know what you're getting into. And you have to either be willing to enjoy it or walk away from it, at some point.
I think we all, writers, you can fall in love with your characters as well. So there are times where we don't change them enough because we like them who they are. And so, I suppose it's a choice that you make to give your character an arc. And in so doing, sometimes maybe as writers, we feel like we miss who they were when we first started, who they were when the story first started. So I can see the appeal of writing an arcless or a flat arc book, because you get to spend more time with that character who you really like. So there's an appeal, a writing appeal.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way.
I'm gonna draw back to episode number 4 where we talked to Sarah Rosette Alida, and we talked about character arcs, and she talked about how her characters don't have huge arcs, so they don't change enough through the series that you can't just pick one, although you would benefit from reading the whole arc. So I mean, I think also there's a danger in thinking that character arcs have to be, especially in some of these kinds of genres that we're talking about, they don't have to be so massive that you can't continue to write this character. But she was talking about how she has little arcs through the books, and there will be a series arc, like her main character changes from book to book, but not so much that she's not instantly recognizable, and that's, which is interesting, to kind of give another twist to it.
Right. It is. I'm glad you brought up Sarah Rosette. She was saying that there are life changes from book to book. So, the kid might be in kindergarten. Now the kid's in first grade, or now the sidekick best friend is married before she was engaged, or whatever. So you just have to be able to go along with whatever those kind of stages of life are. But the person of the protagonist hasn't evolved such that you're going to be confused if you read them out of order. That's a great way to, to offer sort of a middle ground for the arc.
Little arcs.
Yeah.
But I suppose you can have an arc that isn't a massive change, but the stakes can still be high. So, there's other ways, isn't there, to have the emotional connection with the reader and with the story in that way. So in the same way that a flat arc, like a Reacher arc, where there's still an emotional resonance, you can have a not necessarily massively life-changing arc, but still have quite dramatic things happening outside of that. It's all a question of what tells the story best, perhaps. And I like your point, Kathryn, that there's that we're kind of conditioned with the blockbuster movie, and I probably would go back because it was probably Lucas and Star Wars that brought the hero's journey to the front of mind for everyone writing fiction commercially. And so these big movies where the hero must change, and things must be very dramatic. There's a danger that thinking that's the only way to write a gripping story or to produce something that is important. And you're quite right. The arc could be there, but just, nothing huge.
Right. Well, I think it's really important to have some kind of ongoing character who has, if not an arc per se or a big arc, but emotional attachment, like we were talking about Watson and Mary, and then Reachers, who's the female lead in that you're talking about, Kathryn.
I don't remember her name. in the movie.
I don't know if it was a girlfriend or a sister or a sidekick or what, but...
It was just a sidekick.
Okay, sidekick. So, but if you have these heroes who don't have much of an arc, in each book the plot is different and those characters in the plot are different, the emotional attachment, the investment isn't going to build from book to book. But when suddenly Watson is kidnapped or Reacher's sidekick is, has a gun to her head or something, then we've got that series level investment in that character's danger. So it isn't just someone who comes and goes in one book. So that raises the importance of the sidekick character in the Arcless Protagonist series.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Well.
We've just successfully argued that there must be an arc somewhere, Alida. If there's no arc in this book, that's it. I'm rejecting it. I'm not editing that.
Yeah. Well, maybe not. Oh, no. Maybe not an arc somewhere, but at least an emotional investment.
Right.
So if your Arcless Protagonist is a colder, more stoic, or more cerebral character, like a lot of these detective figures or action heroes are, like Batman and Sherlock and Reacher, then you need somebody there, somebody in the sidekick, like Robin, Watson, and that woman whose name we don't know, to give us that kind of warm, fuzzy, I'm really going to care when this person is in danger.
Right.
It's it comes back to the old thing, doesn't it? With Arcus or not, you've got to care about some characters in the book, because otherwise it's you just put that interleaving of plot and character, but at the end of the day, a plot driven story without any care for the character is going to be a pretty light read.
Right.
And so I would always argue more for character than plot to some degree.
Absolutely.
But obviously you can't really have one without the other.
Right. And the it comes back to the two sides of the character coin, likable and fascinating. So the more your protagonist is more fascinating and less likable, then the more important it is to have the likable sidekick to increase the emotional investment. I was thinking also of like Harry Bosch. I haven't read the novels that's based on, but I've watched the series.
Yeah.
And he doesn't really have a sidekick per se, but he's got a daughter. And then he has an ex-wife who's in and out sometimes. And, so you get a sense of this other side of him, the human, relatable side, who's also a father and used to be a husband. And so you can balance the hardcore detective who bucks authority and gets the job done with the dad. And that increases the likable side without bringing in a sidekick necessarily.
Yep.
All right. So final thoughts as we wrap up?
Don't write an Arcless character with an Arcless protagonist unless you've got plenty of other things to make it interesting.
Yeah. So I think Arcless protagonists are definitely doable, but know what you're getting into in terms of repetition and formulaic storylines, and make sure that you balance your character with a sidekick or some other aspect of that character that is likable and relatable to keep the emotional investment high.
That's why they're the exception and not the rule.
Yes. Yes. As I say, you must have a character arc, unless you're writing an Arcless character. Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Cue the music. There we go. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.